Okay, so once again, welcome. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Professor Diane Crumry. I teach English and American literature, and I'm one of the honors faculty. I'd like to also introduce to you some of the other honors faculty, professors who have envisioned and created the intellectually enriched program that we're able to offer you here at UB. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Seton in World Religion, also East Asian Studies, and Dr. Riggs, who's also in World Religion and is in the master's program. And we have with us also today Dr. Haley, who is the Associate Provost and a Professor of World Religion when he has time.
Sometimes we say world religions to make it seem like there's more than one.
World religion. I accept, I take that point. Thank you. And
thank you.
That's right. They're domestic. And I'd like to also, and this one's going to be easy, I'd like to introduce to those of you who perhaps haven't met him yet, Dr. Eves, who is Professor of Philosophy here. And Professor, or Dr. Oberleitner, Professor of Psychology. Or psychologies.
Psychology.
And let me just say that these people have done so much to develop the program. Some of them were have started the honors program long ago, and it's been growing steadily. But I'm most honored to be able to introduce the University of Bridgeport President Emeritus and Distinguished Professor of Religion, Dr. Richard Rubenstein. I should add that any course taught by Dr. Rubenstein is ipso facto an honors course. Although he doesn't teach every semester, he does occasionally honor us with a course, and I would highly recommend taking a course, if you can at all, possibly, with Dr. Rubenstein. One opportunity like that will be this spring when he'll be offering a course. And like I said before, the honors program is really growing. I think it's fair to say that we have twice as many students that as we did 2 years ago, and actively in the honors program, which is a testament to all of you and to the hard work of the people in the honors program, getting the news out to everybody that it's a possibility. So we'll also be offering 6 different honors courses this spring, as you can see on the handouts on the tables. Please also note that there are applications there if you'd like to join the honors program. Courses that you can select from for the spring. And there also are some forms to fill out if you're interested in getting involved, or if you have any ideas that you'd like to share with us that would be good for the honors program. We put a lot of stock in what our students say and the suggestions that they give us. By the way, if you fill out an application, you can leave it, you can give it to us tonight, and if you think about it and fill it out later, you can drop it off at the Sepia office in Carlson, or at my office. I'm in Dana Hall 261. So, our event this evening, I think, will give you a fair impression of the goals and standards of the honors program at UB. And I'm looking at now a group of people who are either here because they are in the honors program or because they're curious about it and interested in joining. This evening is really dedicated to all of you because you challenge us to challenge you, and I hope you get involved in the discussion. We'll first have dinner, but towards the end of that, we'll tell you a little bit about the honors program and answer any questions on the honors program. But the real interest this evening is that we'll have a presentation from Dr. Riggs and Dr. Rubenstein entitled "The Iran Nuclear Program, Differing Views." This will be a discussion between the two of them. I'm given to think that Dr. Haley will be moderating, and we will be happy to respond to questions from the audience after the panel.
Good evening. Thank you, Diane Crummery, for organizing this event. Give her a hand. I'm Stephen Haley, Associate Provost at the University. I also have a faculty appointment in the College of Public and International Affairs, where I'm an Associate Professor of World Religions. I'm delighted with that appointment to be seated here tonight with my colleagues. My role tonight is a modest one, and it is to moderate, to introduce the primary speakers, and then at the end to facilitate some of our discussion. I have very long and copious notes about our two speakers because they're so distinguished and learned, but I'm going to cut down the introduction so as to make more time for them to occupy center stage here and to bring forward their ideas with regard to our topic tonight. Our first speaker is Professor and Dr. Richard Rubenstein. He's Distinguished Research Professor of Religion or World Religions at the University of Bridgeport here. He was formerly president of the university, and he's now also President Emeritus at the University of Bridgeport and also a life member of the Board of Trustees. I cannot begin to talk about his scholarship without turning this into an hour-long presentation myself. He's known without a hint or trace of exaggeration worldwide. His scholarship has changed the nature of discussion about religion and violence and Judaism and Holocaust and 9/11 and post-9/11 thinking about religion. There are only a handful of people in the entire world that enter the realm that he's in. We're delighted that he's joining us to talk tonight on this topic. Please give him a hand. He will be our first speaker.
Thank you, Professor Healy. I want to begin this with something which is more of a plug for our program than a discussion of the issue at hand. When I came to the University of Bridgeport as president, there were no courses on world religion or religion. And I thought that was a mistake. We could say that was partly because I had received my graduate training in the field of religion. And it was not difficult for me to get the Board of Trustees to agree that we needed courses in religion. But I made a fundamental decision for which I am permanently very glad, and that is I decided that the place for courses in world religion was not in the College of Arts and Sciences. I was not interested in religion as literature, although quite assuredly religion and literature have a great deal to do with each other. But I felt that for those students who plan to go into either international commerce, international politics, the UN or other organizations, in the world that we live in, it's absolutely imperative that you have some knowledge of religion. Not a question of what you believe, but it's a question of not only knowing your own tradition, but more important, knowing other traditions. And it was that that motivated me to bring the courses of religion into the what was then the International College, what is now the College of Public and International Affairs. I wanted to mention that to you. Now, I'm going to begin this discussion with a couple of comments on the Ayatollah Khomeini, because I don't think they're irrelevant to what we're trying to do. Ayatollah Khomeini, as a young man, was a very brilliant scholar. He was especially skillful in Aristotelian philosophy, very knowledgeable. By the way, for those of you who read Foreign Affairs, and not the current issue, but the issue before it, had a long interview with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he also is a man with a great knowledge of, in his field, is literature. I doubt that there are many books that he hasn't read in the field. I was impressed by that. But in the case of the Ayatollah Khomeini, he became interested in mysticism along the way, and there is a book by a man named Musa Sadra, 4 Journeys, which he read, and the idea, I don't want to go into detail, but the idea there is that a man can take 4 journeys, and I'm using man in a generic way. At the end of the journey, one not only knows the truth with a capital T, but one has a kind of divine knowledge of the truth. And the reason why this is important is that this became a reflection of Khomeini's self-definition, that it was possible to have a divine knowledge of the truth. And then there's a story which is told, and I told my students about this yesterday, of one of the leading Iranian Ayatollahs, who had been a student of Ayatollah Khomeini, complaining to Khomeini, this was during the Iranian-Iraqi war, that there was too much killing and that Muslims should not be killing other Muslims. And the Ayatollah Khomeini was quiet. And so this student, who by that time was a distinguished scholar, repeated that Muslims should not be killing other Muslims. The third time, the Ayatollah Khomeini responded. And he said, "Do you think that we can fault God when there is an earthquake and many people are killed in that earthquake?" Now the student was horrified by his response, because it indicated that in the Ayatollah Khomeini's self-understanding, there was a connection between what God was doing and what he was responsible for doing. That is to say, that here was a man whose impression of himself almost partook of something quite divine. And that's a danger. That's a very great danger. And I would like to suggest that part of the problem in dealing with Iran is that we are dealing with a country which has an entirely different set of values, not the country as a whole, but the leadership. And that's, for example, we now have a situation in which the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emirati, the United Arab Emirates, and France are afraid of the possibility of Iranian nukes. Well, you get a situation in which the Israelis and the Saudis are on the same side. And my guess, and it's not only a guess, is that Saudi intelligence and Israeli intelligence talk to each other. They'd be fools not to in the situation that they are, because they're both targets. Well, starting with that, one has to understand just exactly what kind of a transformation the Ayatollah Khomeini made. Well, basically, and for those of you who are interested, there's a very good book by a Shiite, Vali Nasser, The Shia Revival. I've read it several times. Dr. Riggs has read the same book. But we can't go into a description of the various stages through which the various parties in Iran went before the Iranian Revolution. But a few points are important. The Iranian Revolution, one of the low points for the West was the way in which the United States CIA cooperated with the British in expelling the then president of, or president or prime minister, I forget which, of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and he doing so because the British wanted to control the oil fields of Iran under situations which were quite advantageous to them, but not to the Iranians. And in order to do this, they were quite willing to get rid of the president. Well, 2 years later, he was back in office. And there were other situations in which the British abused their power. One situation was a question of tobacco. The British wanted to have a tobacco monopoly. Well, they got their tobacco monopoly, and then the ulama, that is the scholars in Iran, forbade the use of tobacco. Well, what happened? By the way, the then Shah played along with the British, but the minute the ulama prohibited the sale of tobacco, women started not using it, and then it spread, and so the population as a whole spread. Now, what the ulama succeeded in doing was opposing British imperialism in an effective way. The British got their permission to have a tobacco franchise, and it wasn't worth anything. And that's where there's a beginning there of the religious group in Iran becoming the group that is seen as the defending Iranian sovereignty, defending Iranian independence, and certainly defending the rights of the Iranian people. There's a whole series of developments which take place. But finally we come to, I believe it was 1978, when that led to the Iranian Revolution, which was clearly one of the most important revolutions in modern history, where the American embassy was seized. And at the end of this, the Ayatollah Khomeini became the ruler of Iran. Now, if you looked at the Ayatollah Khomeini, and in those days I didn't know much about it, but if you looked at him, he looked like a typical Shiite scholar. He wore the right kind of hat, the right kind of beard, the right kind of clothes. But what very few people understood, that this was a man who would radically transform Shiite religion into something quite different than it had ever been before. And to give you the basis of it, this, as a result of their experiences, the Shah was no longer believable to the masses. Plain democracy was no longer believable, and so the Ayatollah Khomeini wrote a book on Islamic governance. And in the book, he says that there's only one group that is capable and, in a sense, divinely charged to rule, and that is the group of scholars, those who know the scholarship from a Shiite point of view, of course. But he goes on to do something else. He not only speaks of the scholars as being those who rule, almost like in Plato's Republic, where it's the philosopher who rules, but more than that, he goes on to say that he has this doctrine of the guardian, the rule of the guardians. But by that he meant one guardian. And that one guardian turned out to be Ayatollah Khomeini, who regarded himself as being divinely legitimated, divinely charged, and in a way speaking for the divine. Now if you add that to the possession of nuclear weapons, I submit you've got a witch's brew. If anybody is scared of Al-Qaeda having nuclear weapons, well, Al-Qaeda is a very dangerous organization, but Iran is a country with, I believe, 70 million people, and it's well organized. You have highly educated cadres there, but you have an apocalyptic, messianic view of the way the world is supposed to be run. Add to this that in Shiite religion, you have a messianic element, without going into detail, that in the 800s, the man who, the boy who was supposed to become the new imam, he was 5 years old, disappeared. God knows what happened to him. He might have been killed, kidnapped, who knows. But in any event, what happened was that the doctrine arose that he was in occultation, and he would remain in occultation until Jesus was about to come, and Jesus coming would indicate that the end of the world is close. And the people who believe in this are called the Twelvers, because this 5-year-old boy, who is believed to be existing somewhere, is regarded as the 12th Imam. Well, with Ahmadinejad, he was a devotee of the 12th Imam. He was what they called a Twelver. And part of the problem was that you have apocalyptic scenarios as to what must happen before Jesus overcomes Digel, the devil, and the end of the world comes. And what's scary about this is that for those who believe in it, an apocalyptic end of things is not unacceptable. Now, I wrote a book called Jihad and Genocide. And one of the questions I kept on asking in my chapter on Iran is Iran currently deterrable? Now, we know that in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, both the United States and the Soviet Union were deterrable. They each knew the horrible damage that nuclear weapons could do, and they didn't want to do it to their own people. And the White House had a phone direct to the Kremlin and the other way around. But we don't know about the Iranians. I'm not saying what they would or would not do. I don't know to what extent the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the real ruler of Iran, shares the kind of self-understanding which the Ayatollah Khomeini had. But you can bet that the Ayatollah Khomeini doesn't wander too far away. Now, among the criticisms I have of American foreign policy is it doesn't have a clue of the importance that religion plays in this whole business. And we have this over and over again. To give a more charitable view of our current Secretary of State, he thinks a deal is possible. But if you're dealing with apocalyptic messianists, a deal may not be possible. And they're not considering that. The same thing can be said about a number of other things in the Middle East. And when you're dealing with a weapon as ultimate as the nuclear weapons, that's really scary. A couple of other comments. I wrote a book on, actually I wrote 2 books on the Holocaust, the destruction of the Jews in Europe. And one lesson that comes out of that experience is that if anybody declares that he intends to destroy Jews or a Jewish state and proceeds to get the weapons with which to do it, one must assume that that person or institution is telling the truth. And the idea that Israel can simply say, leave it up to Barack Obama to make up his mind as to what's what, I think just doesn't work. They're not going to, because all it will take would be 2 or 3 nukes to do in Tel Aviv, and that's the end of it. Of course, that would immediately be followed by the Israelis have 5 Dolphin-class submarines, all of them equipped with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles provided by the Germans. And Tehran is constructed in a kind of a bowl so that as many as 12 million people could be killed by a nuclear attack on Tehran. Now the question then becomes, would that deter the Iranians? And a man like Ali Akbar Rafsanjani, who was a so-called moderate president of Iran, made a statement once. Well, we'll kill off the Israelis, and maybe we'll lose a couple of million people, but we'd still survive. Well, now thinking like that, you're dealing with something quite dangerous. Now, as far as the recent Geneva conferences, I thought I would do is to read to you a summary, if I can find it here, of the, I hope I brought it, a summary of the, yeah, I did, of the statement which was made yesterday by the one of the leaders of the Council for the Defense of Democracy to the House committee which was interrogating Secretary of State Kerry. And they made several points. They're not too long. Point number one is that the United States administration seemed ready to give tens of billions of dollars in irreversible sanction relief. Was one of the things that Kerry wanted to do, was to loosen up on the sanctions. In addition to the unilateral sanctions relief, by blocking new congressional sanctions, the Congress is up in arms, they want to add sanctions, in exchange, and this is the crucial thing, for the promise of reversible nuclear concessions that do not roll back or freeze enough of the critical elements of Iran's military nuclear infrastructure. In other words, the Iraq establishment will not be touched. The Iranians say that, oh, you can trust us with nuclear material, we'll just keep it at 3.5%. Problem with that is the Iranians now have 19,000 centrifuges, which can bring that up to weapons-grade uranium very, very quickly. The administration has also undermined the deterrent effect of the U.S. military option. And one of the things that the Soviet Union knew was that the United States meant it. You nuke us, we will nuke you. And neither the Soviet Union nor the United States wanted to be nuked. Senior administration officials have repeatedly warned about the grave dangers of U.S. or Israeli preemptive military strikes. Now, so far there hasn't been an Israeli preemptive strike. But if the Israelis feel that they're cornered and the option is simply to wait around until the nukes fall on Tel Aviv, you can bet there will be a preemptive strike. And one of the reasons why the Israelis have 200 nukes, that Barack Obama wanted to have the Near East become, the Middle East become a nuclear-free zone, is because they knew that they were outnumbered by people who felt that they were an affront to the region, that they didn't belong in the region, and that they had to be gotten rid of. Well, that's okay. And what you have to do in a situation like that is have an equalizer. And for the Israelis, the nukes were the equalizer. Right now, Saudi Arabia is in the process of purchasing a nuclear weapon from Pakistan. In all these years, the Saudis were not afraid of the Israelis because they knew that the Israelis had no interest or intention to strike out at them or anybody else. They certainly would strike out if they were attacked, and not attacked with ordinary weapons. So that this became a real issue. Now, when you undermine the deterrent credibility of the U.S. military option, you're really playing with fire. Senior administrative officials have repeatedly warned of the grave dangers, I'm repeating myself, of Israeli preemptive military strikes. With enhanced economic measures and the military option off the table, the administration is now hoping that it can constrain the nuclear ambitions of the Islamic Republic by diplomacy alone. Well, maybe it'll work and maybe it won't work, but in history we know that words and promises are not a very credible answer to the possibility of a threat, especially if on time after time after time the Iranians have made it quite clear that they intend to nuke the Israelis. I mean, they haven't been bashful about it. And one other factor, they call the United States the Great Satan. The United States has done some terrible things to them. And they call Israel the Little Satan. These are theological terms. These are not political terms. And what they show is what's involved here has got something that's got nothing to do with ordinary politics, because from the point of view of ordinary politics, the Israelis and the Iranians got along quite well and did business very well. They were not economic competitors before the revolution. So the administration is hoping that it can constrain the nuclear ambitions of the Islamic Republic by diplomacy, leading to a verification and inspection regime. That is, they think that if all you do is look at what the Iranians are doing, you'll be able to do enough, and the Iranians won't do anything behind your back. And that will allow the situation to continue, and there will be no nuclear exchange. And this would be based upon trust with an Iranian leadership that has a 3 decades long track of saying one thing and then doing another thing. And then, of course, keep in mind the name of Wendy Sherman, important lady. She is the chief State Department negotiator at Geneva with Iran. Wendy Sherman was also the chief State Department negotiator under Bill Clinton with North Korea. And it was her job to use some combination of inducements to get the North Koreans not to have nuclear weapons. Well, Bret Stephens in the New York Herald Tribune said the other day that Wendy Sherman is an example of something that happens often in Washington. She fails upward. She fails in one job, so you're promoted to a higher job. And what did she do? Well, Wendy Sherman is now the one who was doing the negotiations with the Iranians. And they're lusting after an agreement. Barack Obama and Kerry are lusting after an agreement. They thought they had it. That's why all the foreign ministers came. And then the French spoiled the party. And the reason the French spoiled the party was very simple. The French have been in the business of diplomacy and working in the Middle East for centuries. And you could not fool them the way, apparently, Barack Obama and Kerry could be fooled. Now, to rationalize their decision, to conclude an interim nuclear deal that falls well short of even the minimum requirements recommended by nuclear experts, the administration is betting on the hope that Rouhani is a true pragmatist. Well, we know enough about Rouhani to know that he can talk sweetly, but he has a track record. And that track record is being one of the inner circle of the ruling elite, and having bragged in the past of having been able to get things by being a little nicer than the other guy. Now, U.S. officials, here I conclude, know that Rouhani is lying when he says that the Islamic Republic has never had any intention of building an atomic weapon. Defecting Iranian nuclear engineers told U.S. officials in the late 1980s that the Mullah's program was designed exclusively to have such an arms. That is, That's what they were doing. You don't build plutonium plants for any other reason than weapons. Okay. They have 19,000 centrifuges, a heavy water plant, a robust ballistic missile program, and they have the testing capability, if they haven't done it already, of nuclear trigger technology. Everything Western intelligence services have tracked since then matches those early revelations. So we are in a very dangerous spot. My last word is this. In ancient times, the Persians expanded to the point they were almost able to conquer Greece. And to think that there isn't in Persia, Iran, some of that same nuclear, that same ambition today is a mistake. I think, for example, of Cyrus the King, who not only threatened the Greeks, but also conquered Babylon and Jerusalem. So this is nothing new. These things go on in the Middle East, and they don't stop. Thank you very much for your time.
In my haste to get off of the podium to introduce Richard, I failed to talk about the structure of the evening, so I'll do that now. We are having a primary presentation by both speakers, and so now I'll introduce Professor Riggs to give his primary presentation. Following that, we'll have them each give very brief statements about what the other has said, and then following that, take some questions and answers and perhaps comments from you all, and I'll help to moderate that. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Robert Riggs to the group here. He's an assistant professor and chair of the World Religions Program here at the University of Bridgeport. He is obviously newer in his scholarly journey. He is not as distinguished as Professor Rubenstein, but I'm here to tell you his scholarly gravitas runs deep. I was reviewing his material earlier in advance of this, and I found myself to be quite astounded at the level of erudition that he has and brings to this, and for being such a young person, and I can say that now that I'm starting to feel older. About 15 years ago, I was hired to be in the faculty position that Robert Riggs is now occupying. And I can tell you, and with no trace of anything but admiration, Robert Riggs's work in this program exceeds mine by an immeasurable amount. He's a brilliant young thinker. He will, guarantee you, bring an alternative vision to this discussion. And as an intellectual, he is the equal here of Richard Rubenstein. And so I'm very much delighted to introduce him and looking forward to what he has to share. Give him a hand.
I'm extremely humbled by that introduction. Really, I definitely cannot claim to be the intellectual equal of Dr. Rubenstein by any stretch. I'm just early on in my own scholarly journey. But I'm very, very, very grateful that Dr. Rubenstein was willing to participate in this event with me. You know, it's a great honor to share the podium with you, and I hope that I can do some justice to this topic, as you did just now. So I put together a very, very short slideshow that, because, you know, I don't want to assume that that when we talk about Iran that we necessarily all are on the same page. You know, Iran as a modern nation state with the current borders really goes back less than 100 years to the 1920s. But Iran is also an incredibly diverse country. One of the goals of my presentation is to present what I think are some reasons for hope in terms of the possibility of some type of diplomatic reconciliation, as well as, or at least, the possibility of deterrence. Because my own view of Iran is that it is a rational actor as a state, and its leadership acts in a way that is extremely self-interested, and therefore would be, in my opinion, or at least my analysis of it, would be very unlikely to use a weapon, even if it did develop one. And it's also unclear to me that the Iranians have clear intention to develop one, at least from the evidence that we have. But before I talk about the reasons why I say that, there's a few reasons why Iran, there is a great cause for concern here. And I share the concern that Dr. Rubenstein expressed in terms of the lack of current diplomacy and relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and the implication that that has for Iran's behavior. And Dr. Rubenstein mentioned in his talk the very famous event in 1953 when the CIA engineered a coup to overthrow Mossadegh, the prime minister of Iran at that time. And interestingly, the CIA, when they went to Iran and engineered this coup, they did it through bringing suitcases filled with cash and giving part of that money to some of the clerics, some members of the ulama, the religious scholars of the time. One famous one's name is Nouri. And I say this to talk a bit about the clerics, because this is a topic that I can speak to intelligently, which is the nature of clerical authority and leadership in Shiite Islam generally, and also more specifically in Iran. It is very true that Ayatollah Khomeini practiced a type of Islamic mysticism called Irfan, and he did study Mullah Sadra, who was a famous medieval Shiite mystic thinker. But Mullah Sadra himself started a school in Islamic philosophy called the Illuminationist School. And Khomeini, in his own interpretation of Mullah Sadra, took it in a direction that I'm not convinced that Mullah Sadra himself would have appreciated. Khomeini did act as an earthquake in Shiite Islam in terms of the things he wrote and the way he viewed himself and his theory of the guardianship of the jurist, meaning the leadership of the primary, he meant by it, the leadership of the primary, most learned religious scholar, which Dr. Rubenstein rightly said was, in his view, himself, which came out in the way that he took leadership after the Iranian Revolution. However, Shiite Islam, although it's hierarchical, holds a strong place for contestation of authority. What do I mean by that? I mean that within Shiite Islam, there is no one Ayatollah. The Ayatollah is really an Iranian, even though it's an Arabic word, Ayat Allah, which means the verse of God, or the sign, the miraculous sign of God. It's really a term that's applied to top-level religious leaders in Shiite Islam in Iran. The term, yes, we refer to certain people outside of Iran as Ayatollahs, but within other societies outside of Iran that have Shiite populations, they themselves don't use the term Ayatollah. They use other terms like Sayyid, which goes back to somebody that's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, or other terms similar to that. So Ayatollah Khomeini lived in Iraq for a period of time. He was a strong critic of the Shah of Iran, the King of Iran, in the 1960s and 70s, for which he was sent, or he went into exile first, and he lived in Najaf, Iraq, which is a very famous Shiite city. It's the center of Shiite Islam, not Iran. The center of Shiite Islam is actually this southern city of Iraq, in Iraq, called Najaf, which swallowed up an earlier city called Kufa, which is one of the very earliest Islamically established cities. It was founded by the early Muslim conquerors when they came out of Arabian Peninsula, very early in Islamic history. And it's the site where Ali, the first imam in Shiite Islam, is buried. And so Najaf has held a very, very strong position as a symbolic center for Shiite Islam and as a center for education, long before Iran became Shiite, long before Iran became a center for Shiism. So Khomeini, when he lived in Najaf, he came as an Iranian, living in a city that was filled with some Iranian, some Arab, some Afghani, some Pakistani, because Shiite Islam is a minority branch of Islam that's located among communities throughout the world. And Najaf is the attraction point. It's the magnet where all the Shiite leaders will go for education. It's kind of like if you went to, it's the Harvard of Shiism, right? If you want to become a known, a most important Shiite leader, you have to have spent some time studying in Najaf. So Khomeini comes to Najaf as an already well-established, deep thinker, Shiite Islamic scholar, with certain ideas that he had his own interpretations of Shiite Islam that were very much an innovation. They were a change. His view, his theory on the guardianship or the leadership of the most learned religious leader was an innovation. It was something that the majority of the Shiite scholars did not agree with in Najaf. In fact, one of the most important Shiite scholars at the time, his name was Khoury, was a well-known competitor to Khomeini, and under the table, because in Shiite Islam there's a sort of code of conduct. I don't walk up to Ayatollah Khomeini if I'm another Ayatollah and insult him to his face, but I might tell my students to avoid his learning circle and avoid his company. And so there was this strong division that developed in Shiite Islam, especially with the kind of ascendancy of Khomeini. So Khomeini then leaves from Najaf because he became viewed as dangerous by the Iraqi regime. He goes to France and stays in exile in France. And he did something when he was in France that I view as a sign that although he did have definitely had an apocalyptic, messianic self-view, or at least a very strong sense of ego, at minimum, in viewing himself as godlike. He did something that I look at as a point of realpolitik, which was he was in France with some of his students, and he was writing and teaching about his views on himself, or on the guardianship of the jurist, but he was also writing and recording on tapes. I don't know, maybe a lot of you don't even know what tapes are anymore, but cassette tapes, right? Pre-CD, certainly pre-iPod. He was recording speeches that were anti-Shah and very nationalistic, and had a lot of themes against the U.S., against Israel, against the Shah. Very political speeches that he was recording, and his students were taking them back to Iran and making copies of the tapes and distributing them. But what he wasn't doing at the same time was he wasn't recording his sermons and his teachings about the guardianship of the jurist and the fact that he viewed himself as the proper leader for Iran and distributing those to everyone else in Iran. Because he knew, I believe, that he knew that the Iranian people were very diverse in their political opinions at that time. There were labor unions, there were all types of Marxists, there were Islamic Marxists, there were secular Marxists, there were women's rights groups, there were various divisions within the clerical community. And so he sent back a message that was truncated and shortened and abbreviated in a way that put him forward as this revolutionary leader. Not as somebody who was a revolutionary leader that also wanted to take over the state and become the dictator for all intents and purposes. So even though when he did come back to Iran, and Shah departed in February 1979, and he came back and then eventually was acclaimed, and you can see videos of him getting off the plane and being surrounded by millions of people cheering for him. It's not clear to me that those millions of people that were cheering for Ayatollah Khomeini were cheering for the true Ayatollah Khomeini, or the fully unveiled version of himself. They were cheering for this revolutionary leader that was that had opposed the Shah, right? That had opposed oppression and torture and many of the economic inequalities that they experienced under the Shah. So my view of Khomeini is a bit different, right? I do think that he behaved in a way that was very self-assured and possibly did view himself as being guided by God. However, he also had an element of rationality even to him. And I say this as a starting point because when we look at Khamenei, the current leader of Iran that comes after Khomeini, his academic credentials, although he is knowledgeable in literature, his credentials as a religious scholar and thinker are questionable at best. And I say this as someone who's read some of his writing and compared it with other thinkers who I view as superior to him in Shia Islam that oppose Khomeini. Khomeini was appointed by Khomeini right before his death. He had been the president of Iran in the 1980s, the current Ayatollah. He had been a politician in Iran. He also participated in the Iran-Iraq War. He was a competitor to Mousavi, who was the person who ran against Ahmadinejad for president in 2009. Mousavi in the 1980s was the prime minister of Iran, while Khamenei was the president. While Ayatollah Khomeini, if this gets any more confusing, was the Ayatollah. So what you're talking about now is you're talking about a country that is governed by a man who was much more of a political leader than he was a religious leader. And I believe that his behavior since the death of Khomeini has been more rational and I mean by that, not that rational means that it was humane. I don't want to confuse the two, right? Don't confuse the idea of being a humanitarian with being rational, right? Somebody could make a choice that they make based on self-interest as a rational choice that you may not agree with and might cause a great deal of problems, right? So his actions since he took over the state of Iran in 1989 have been, I believe, very rational. He's collected a great deal of personal wealth. There was an article that came out in Reuters, an investigative article recently that investigated his personal wealth and gauged it at somewhere around $95 billion, much of which was gathered by confiscating landed property from other Iranians. You know, is this the actions of a messianic apocalyptic leader who thinks that the end of the world is coming if he's collecting $95 billion in personal wealth that ostensibly he can then pass on to his children. It seems, it's at least questionable to me if that's the case. And if you peel back the onion even further and look at the other leadership in Iran that aren't the supreme leader, because they always refer, in Iran, in Persian, they always refer to Ayatollah Khamenei as Rahbar. Rahbar means the supreme leader. So they don't really refer to him as Ayatollah Khamenei, he's Rahbar. So if you look beyond the Rahbar to other leaders and wealthy business owners in Iran, many of them are the same, synonymous. So the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the elite military branch of Iran, they were established by Khomeini after the revolution. They're viewed as the elite section of the Iranian army. They're also fabulously wealthy business owners. They own telecommunications networks. They own much of the infrastructure of Iran. The major shareholders are these supposed guardians of the revolution. Thirdly, the behavior of Iran when it comes to their development of their nuclear program has been very strategic. The Iranians, now strategic doesn't mean that they're not trying to develop a nuclear weapon. In fact, it wouldn't entirely surprise me if one of their goals is to develop nuclear weapons. It wouldn't shock me. What they've done, you can see from this map, is they've spread out their enrichment and different facilities throughout the country, because the Iranians learned very, very well from the Iraqi experience. In 1980, maybe 81, I believe I'm mixing up the two, it's either 80 or 81, Israel launched a unilateral preemptive attack on Iraq and bombed an Iraqi nuclear facility where they were concerned that Iraq was developing the capability for nuclear weapons. And Iraq's entire nuclear program, or at least the majority of it, was located in one place. And it was within striking distance, and it was still a long distance for the Israelis to fly their jets, and it was not sure that they would return. But they did it, and they demolished the nuclear capability of Iraq and set them back by many, many years, because it was all in one place. So the Iranians have now placed their nuclear program throughout the country. They're already many, many, many miles further from Israel than Iraq was, which is a strategic move. I think it's the move of a rational actor, of a state that has its own self-preservation at heart. And a couple other smaller points that I think need to be taken into account when we think about Iran is that there's one of the big proofs that are put forward by the U.S. and by other European powers for why they think Iran is trying to develop a nuclear weapon program, not just a nuclear program. Because Iran is allowed to develop a nuclear program under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they are one of the early signatories to. Right? The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty allows for countries to develop a civilian nuclear program as long as it's properly overseen by the UN, in this case the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. But the Iranians, one of the reasons that people say the Iranians are trying to develop a nuclear weapons, there's a number of different reasons given. One has to do with the fact that there was intelligence given by a group of exiles, of Iranian exiles in 2002 that unveiled what they said was intelligence proving that Iran had a nuclear weapon program, or at least the intent to develop a nuclear weapon program, which allowed for more scrutiny. And when the international community began to scrutinize the Iranian program more closely, they found that there were irregularities, let's put it that way, in the way they were behaving. And they view that as proof for the Iranians' intent to develop a nuclear program, because they said, why are they being so secretive? Why are they hiding certain parts of their program? But I would submit that an alternative way of viewing this is that the Iranians are scared. And here's why. This is a map of US bases. Here's Iran. Now, these are outdated. This map is outdated. I couldn't find one that was updated because the Iraqis have refused the US to base its military in Iraq any longer since 2011 because, well, we don't need to get into the Iraq War and the results. But in any case, you can understand. But I do believe that Iran is viewing the US from a position of a great deal of suspicion. Not just because of 1953, but because of events that took place after 1953. The Iran-Iraq War, when the US was arming or funding the arming of Iraq to kill Iranians, right? When the US shot down in 1987 an Iranian civilian aircraft and killed 200 and some civilians. Imagine if somebody shot a missile and shot down an American airliner, right, and killed 200 or 300 Americans. What would the U.S. response be to that? You know, the Iraq used chemical weapons against the Iranians. Chemical weapons which were, well, they were allowed to use, I should say, by their supporters at the time in the 1980s. You know, the Iranians have now one of the heaviest, most harsh set of sanctions placed upon them in recent history that is causing massive inflation in Iran. A lot of, you know, increasing the economic inequality. And the argument for sanctions is that it's placing pressure on the regime, it's bringing them back to the table, hopefully. But one of the results of sanctions internally in a country is that the regime can use them as a propaganda tool to their own people and say, oh, look, the price of bread doubled overnight. That's the great Satan's fault. So, so what I'm trying to then argue for is that we need a change of direction. I'm not certain that Obama and Kerry's current strategy is the most effective way, or that it will work. But I would argue that the status quo isn't working. Iran continues to enrich uranium. They've enriched it up to 20%, which is the level you need to enrich uranium to do medical research. So there's three different important numbers for uranium enrichment. 3.5% is for electricity. 20% is for medical research and radioactive isotopes and things for chemotherapy and things like that. And 90% is for nuclear weapons. They've enriched it to 20%, but once you develop the technology that allows you to enrich it to 20%, it's not a long leap to get to 90%. It's a matter of building more centrifuges, running them for a longer period of time, collecting the material. But then after you collect the material, then you have to have the delivery system to deliver the attack. You have the very specific technology, and it's not clear, based on at least CIA current intelligence, it's not clear that the Iranians have been able to reach that point. In fact, they keep pushing the years back. Right? So they initially were saying by 2009, by 2012, now it's end of 2015. And there is yet, according to at least in U.S. and other intelligence, even the Israeli intelligence estimates, there is no clear evidence that they have made a decision as a regime to go forward with enriching to 90%. We don't have any evidence that they've enriched anything to 90% yet. All of this to say that that I do believe that the Iranian regime is a rational actor, that it's possible to deter them. Even if they did get a weapon, I would argue that their desire to gain a weapon isn't to eradicate Israel, but rather it's to defend themselves. It's to defend themselves in a region where they're viewed not just by Israel as hostile, but very much by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And that perhaps one of the ways to prevent them from aggressive behavior is to provide some type of security guarantees. Right? Well, the U.S. provides a lot of security guarantees to the Gulf countries, which is one of the reasons why they haven't developed nuclear weapons in reaction to Israel. We'll protect you, we say, right? You know, perhaps this is a strategy that should be approached, or should be at least thought about. Perhaps reversing entirely the sanctions regime and instead opening up a robust trade relationship with Iran as a way to take some of the economic power out of the hands of the regime in some ways and put it into the hands of other Iranians that might and do certainly oppose the regime. There's no question that a large percentage of Iranians hate the mullahs, as they refer to all the ulama. In Iranian Farsi, they don't refer to them as ulama, as scholars. They refer to the entire class of religious scholars now as mullahs. And they're the butt of all Iranian jokes. If you're riding in Tehran and a mullah gets in a taxi, 9 times out of 10, the taxi driver will kick him out of the taxi and say, "Get out of here." One of the unintended results of Khomeini merging together political and religious authority in Iran was a backlash against Shiite religion in Iran. Right? More and more Iranians are becoming less and less religious. And I do agree entirely with Dr. Rubenstein that we need to, and I should agree since I'm a professor of world religions, that we do need to include religion as an important category in our analysis of Iran. But my own analysis of the nature of religion and politics in Iran is that the power and the strength of the authority of the ulama is eroding day by day in Iran. So I think I'll end there. I think I've said more than enough to chew on, and we'll go from that point.
Our next installment will be brief comments from the speakers to each other, and I'm using the word brief and I'm eyeballing both of them because they've shown you that they know so much that it's hard for them to be brief about this passionate topic. I also want you all to see here a demonstration of religious studies as an enterprise. These two gentlemen here very, very strongly feel what they're talking about down into the essence of their being. And yet they are presenting this as scholars and not as provocateurs. And that is one of the first and primary lessons that's cultivated in religious studies. So notice that, and do consider not only joining the honors program, but joining this as a major program unless you're already otherwise occupied. It would be a wonderful thing for you to do. And do tonight. Richard, would you like to sit there and I'll bring the microphone, or do you wish to stand? Or how do you want to handle comments?
I think I can see people better if I stand up.
Okay.
I'll come over there. First of all, I want to express my appreciation for Dr. Rigg's scholarship and his presentation. It was superb. Both he and I are dealing in the area of conjecture. We really don't know. And whatever we do is a gamble. Yeah, that's better.
One more time.
One more time. If I had my druthers, if there were a diplomatic solution possible, I would certainly favor that over anything else, because the fact of the matter is that if there's another big Middle Eastern war, it's not going to help anybody, neither the Israelis nor the Americans, and it's something we should all try to avoid. So that's where I start. But there's one element in this that undoubtedly has to do with the fact that I'm Jewish, and incidentally I'm also an ordained rabbi. And that is, after the Holocaust, it's very dangerous to tell Jews we're going to destroy you. Believe me, it is dangerous. And that's precisely what not only the Iranians have done, but people throughout the Middle East. And as a result of that, Israelis believe them. And by the way, so do a lot of other Jews. I spent my life, one of the areas in which I spent my life was on the extermination of the Jews of Europe. And I do not value promises very highly. And I don't value assurances very highly. So I'm starting out from a different place than Dr. Riggs is. If I look at it from a Iranian point of view, I can see the Iranian leadership taking a look at Muammar Gaddafi and saying, well, you know, he had nukes, and he gave them up, and look what happened to him. A good argument for wanting to have nukes. The whole thing is a very dangerous thing. But, and you can say I'm wrong, you can say the Israelis are wrong, but in my gut, I know that there are people out there who are determined to kill us. And not only are they determined to kill us, but there's one difference between now, I used to say this when I was at Florida State, and 1939 to 1945. I used to say to my students this, I say, you know, let's assume that in 1939, everything that the worst anti-Semites said about the Jews was absolutely true. But also assume that there were 100 million Jews in Europe and that they were fully armed with weapons. Would there have been an extermination? And my students, who were almost entirely Southern Protestants, would say, of course not. And then I would say, well, what do you think was the real fault of the Jews? They hemmed and hawed, they didn't want to be impolite, and I said, I'll tell you what the real fault of the Jews was. The real fault of the Jews is they didn't have the arms to protect themselves and defend themselves. And that's the secret of the 200 nukes. Now, they've never been used by Israel for very good reason. If Israel uses it preemptively, they'll become an international pariah far more than they are right now. One thing to be almost universally unpopular comes with the trade. It's quite different to be seen as a gratuitous mass murderer. And that's something they're not going to do. But where I disagree with Dr. Riggs, and by the way, we like each other and we spend time with each other. We have lunch together. Where I disagree with him is there's a level of hope and trust in him that is absolutely impossible for me. And that's, as a matter of fact, in Jihad and Genocide, I wrote, after World War II, it's a very dangerous thing to threaten Jews with extermination. Because some of them have learned the lesson. So, I don't know how this thing's going to end. I don't think it's being well handled by Obama or Kerry. I also feel that Obama can no longer say, "Trust me." After the failure of Obamacare, after the failure, I mean, nobody told him that he had to say that Syria poison gas is a red line. But to say it's a red line and then to do nothing about it, no world leader should do that. And so we have, I know a lot of people liked Obama, but we have a crisis, a serious crisis of leadership now. Because nobody believes our leaders. And with very good reason. Again, I repeat, the Saudis don't believe him. They deliberately campaigned to have a UN seat, and then they said, "Oh, we didn't want it." That was their message to the United States. It's their way of saying, this is what we think of your guarantees. And so, that being the case, the whole situation is tragic, very, very tragic. And I don't want to see it end up with a big explosion, but I have no way of, I simply don't share Professor Riggs's informed, very informed analysis of the situation. His presentation was a model of knowledge of the situation. But in spite of that, I can neither trust them, nor can I trust Obama and Kerry.
Well, I'll keep my comments as brief as I can. Yeah, it is, I agree entirely with Dr. Rubenstein in terms of the danger of the situation. And I do appreciate that he's optimistic and hopeful. Those of you that know me know that that is true. However, when it comes to this specific situation, I'm attempting to view it from the point of view of policy and historical evidence, and I don't see the same apocalyptic viewpoint in the current leadership of Iran that maybe a generation earlier was held. Yes, Ahmadinejad as a young man was allegedly, even possibly, one of the people who took over the American embassy, or at least there was allegations that he was in some of these videos or pictures, although it's a little unclear from the picture if it was really him. But you know, Ahmadinejad at the same time was and is a very, very savvy politician. He has a PhD in civil engineering from a good university in Iran. He was the mayor of Tehran before he became the president of the country. And I once did a discourse analysis of his speeches that he gave, and the ones that he gave internationally versus the ones that he gave domestically. It was very, very interesting to see the type of language he used when he was talking to a domestic audience versus the different international communities at the UN versus other speeches and negotiations. And one of the things that he did, depending on where he was speaking in Iran, was he played up certain negative stereotypes that Iranians had for the sake of gaining votes. He was a great politician, and some of the things he would use anti-Israeli rhetoric. Now, the problem is, and this is a problem that I entirely agree with Dr. Rubenstein on, and it's a major problem in the Middle East still to this day, which is there is a plethora of conspiracy theories floating around about the Jews, right? And how they're behind everything. And he and I were talking about this the other night. You know, it's a repeat of old stereotypes about the Jews that go back centuries. And unfortunately, those types of stereotypes are being propagated in the educational curriculum in a lot of countries in the Middle East. Now, some of that curriculum is being reformed slowly, and the infusion of private schools and private universities into the Middle East is changing the game as well, because the state doesn't have a monopoly on knowledge any longer. But that being said, there is a generation, and I would fully acknowledge this, who grow up, or maybe even the younger generation, that grow up saying things such as what I heard from one of my Iranian friends. "Ah, did you hear that Ahmadinejad was an Israeli agent?" I looked at my friend and said, "You know he said that Israel is going to disappear from the pages of time?" That's what he literally said in Farsi. He didn't technically say wipe them off the map. He said they would disappear from the pages of time. And it got translated as wipe them off the map. And maybe he was making a slightly more nuanced argument by saying that Israel is a historical anomaly and that eventually, like the Crusader states, they will disappear, which is what he was really saying. That's not very much comfort to the Israelis, obviously. That's not much better, because it still shows an intent to be against the existence of the State of Israel. So, but that being said, I looked at my friend and I said, "You're telling me the president of Iran, who said these things at the UN, is an Israeli agent?" And he said, yeah, he is, because what other person would do such damage to Iran's international reputation? He had to have been put up to it by Israel. I mean, now, you know, it's laughable. We chuckle about it, but this is the problem with conspiracy theories, is that if you start out with a premise, the Jews are behind everything, you can always find evidence to support your premise. Even though when you take the evidence by itself, it may not lead to that same conclusion. So that would be my final kind of comment and I guess warning to you as younger scholars is beware of conspiracy theories, because I've noticed it amongst many of you. I'm sorry to say it. The whole 9/11 truther movement and a lot of other things like this, we need to be rigorous, and if a lot of you want to go into policy making and working to try to move towards a more just and peaceful world, you need to go in that direction from a basis in knowledge, real deep knowledge of an area and of a region and of the language and of the culture and of the history. And that, I guess, is my kind of exhortation to you, my mini sermonette is, you know, move towards that direction because it's well worth it. But I'll leave you with the same question mark as Dr. Rubenstein, right? We don't really know what the end result of this is all going to be. We're looking at it and we're both trying to rigorously analyze it based on what we do know and come up with conjectures about what we hope will happen. And I'm very glad, and I share the same sentiment as Dr. Rubenstein, is that the last thing any of us want to see is more people dead. Right, the very last thing that we want to see that, and I do hope that the resolution will be peaceful for this. So.
Professor Riggs, have you heard the students circulating the Haley as a rock star movement?
the conspiracy theory? Sure.
I guess you haven't heard. Do any of you have a question for either of our speakers? Yes.
Good evening. My name is Ruan. I'm a GLDP student. I'm from Syria. Thank you very much for the lecture. Actually, I have two questions for Dr. Rubenstein. First, the question is, you mentioned that Iran has no right to have nuclear weapon whatsoever because of, it's going to be a threat for Israel. But at the same time, why Israel has the right to have nuclear weapons and we as countries not to feel threatened by Israel to use these weapons against us? Just a second. The second question would be, I think there is a difference between Jews and Zionists. I believe that we have no problem coming from Middle East having Jews as a religion party within our communities, but we have problem with the Zionists because even inside Israel, and I have friends who are Israeli inside Tel Aviv, they have this kind of discrimination if you are like a Jew from a European dissident or like an Arab and still you're a Jew from an Arab dissident or like African. So I don't think it's a matter of Jew, it's a matter of Zionists that make this kind of clash. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Your first statement was, why should the Israelis have the right to nuclear weapons and the Syrians, for example, not have that right? Well, first of all, I didn't speak of rights. I don't claim...
Why do you feel threats that Iran has nuclear weapons?
Hold it. I listen to you respectfully. I didn't speak of rights. People have weapons if they have the power to get them. And they will keep weapons only as long as they have the power to get them. Nobody says that Iran does not have a right, maybe some people do with the myth of the United Nations, but in reality, Iran has neither a right or not a right to weapons. The question for Iran is it in its national interest to acquire weapons? And there are reasons why the Iranians would want weapons. There are also reasons why the Iranians would not want weapons. But rights have nothing to do with it. The whole language of rights, when you're dealing with international politics, I submit has nothing to do with it. What is really involved are power conflicts. And that's why I said, when I spoke before, I'd asked my students in Florida, what was the fault of the Jews during World War II, assuming that every terrible thing that can be said about them is true. And the answer is clear. They didn't have the guns to defend themselves. Okay, now let's go to the second, Jews versus Zionists. You know, I wrote a paper which my students in my class have to read. It's called My Grandmother's Paper Bag. And my grandmother was a very Orthodox Jewish woman. And when I was a youngster, maybe an adolescent, I went to her house and I opened a drawer. And this was during the time of Palestine was under the British Mandate. And I saw there was a paper bag there, and on the outside of the paper bag, it was addressed to her, and the stamp was the stamp of the British Mandate. But in the bag, there was only dirt. Nothing else, just dirt. And I knew that I wasn't supposed to ask her what this was all about. And the next time I saw that paper bag was when they were lowering her casket into the ground. Her oldest son took that paper bag and poured the dirt on the casket. This was her symbolic way of coming home, because for her, there was only one home, and that home was Palestine. Now, the Jews are not the only people who regard Palestine as their home. And Arabs would say, okay, that was 2,000 years ago, but a lot has happened since then. One of the problems with religion, and especially religion in the Middle East, is that people have long memories. And so when you try to divide Jews and Zionists, now I'm not a Zionist in the sense that I didn't want to live in Israel. During the Six-Day War, I was over there, and I met David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel. He said, "Why aren't you here?" And I said, "Because I would rather be a professor in the United States than a high school teacher in Tel Aviv. And I liked it better here, and I was more comfortable here." Now, you may have Israeli friends, because the question about Israeli friends is, Israel is divided, and there is a left wing in Israel that has grave doubts about Jewish nationalism. And they would tell you the things that they do. Well, that's their privilege. But the fact of the matter is that after World War II, nobody wanted them. The only place they could go when the British were trying to keep them out was Palestine. So they went there, and then in 1948, the United Nations said that they were an independent state, but that's not what created Israeli independence, because all of the Arab countries, all of them surrounding, including Syria, converged to destroy Israel. Well, the reason Israel survived is because Israel had learned the lesson, was militarily capable of surviving. And my attitude is very simple. Israel will survive as long as it is militarily capable of surviving. And when it's no longer militarily capable of surviving, it'll go down. That's happened to other countries in the past. But if one has to be a disarmed, stranger in somebody else's country, which the Jews were in Europe, or be an endangered species in a land that which they have ancestral memories, quite a number of them prefer to be in that land, realizing that Arabs feel the same way about that land. That's what's called conflict. And I don't know how you can solve that conflict, because the Arabs aren't going to stop feeling that it's their land. And I'm not telling you that you should. But I'm also not going to say that because the Arabs feel it is their land, that the Israelis have no claim there. Let me just add one thing. You know, I was in Israel about 3 weeks after the Six-Day War. And I have to tell you this, I was on the Golan Heights, I was in Quneitra, not as an officer or anything like that, but I had press connections. And one of the things that happened is I have a very good friend who has taught at Harvard, one of the great Protestant theologians of the 20th century, a man by the name of Harvey Cox. Harvey Cox was until recently the Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard. Now, the Hollis Professor of Divinity is something very special because it is the first endowed chair, not at Harvard, but in America. And we were talking at the Union Theological Seminary in New York a couple of weeks after the end of the Six-Day War, and he said, "You know, Richard, I believe in Israel's right to exist, but I don't believe in conquest." And I said, "In what century don't you believe in conquest? When your ancestor conquered Connecticut and did the Pequot Indians in? When other Americans conquered Texas, New Mexico, Arizona? The world has always been run on conquest. Islam spread because of conquest." So my answer is, and I don't believe that's ever going to stop, my answer is, The Israelis will survive as long as they have the power to survive. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Professor Sell.
Cox answer.
He didn't. When I said, when I said, all he said was, what do you mean? And then I mentioned Connecticut and I mentioned Arizona and stuff like that. And we're good friends. We have always been good friends.
Anybody else? A question? Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for 2 intellectual speeches. It was brilliant, I gotta say. My name is Ron. I just actually have a question with both of you, actually. I don't remember if it was just Dr. Riggs who stated it, but I believe you said that how the new generation is kind of having a different sense and understanding of what the religious aspect is towards their social and political realms. And that's significantly different compared to the elders or the people who run the country. And that's why I think what I'm kind of getting from the sense of that is that that's why you think there's a difference now, or soon to come, as into allowing Iran to have nuclear capabilities. With that being said, would you, and then hearing Dr. Rubenstein's answers about how conflict has been and shall always remain the main factor in the world with regards to domination, do you think that might possibly change since with people's different idealistical purposes, as in instead of thinking that they have to conquer somebody, why not leave it up to their individual choice? Because some other people decide to just randomly up and convert and just twist the whole world that they know upside down.
Professor Riggs, do you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Really excellent question, actually. It's, you know, it's this question about, I mean, I agree. I'm a historian. I mean, the world has been built on conquest after conquest and conflict over and over again. That's very clear. The question is that should we take into account globalization as a factor in a potential way of ameliorating or lowering the possibilities of conflict between nations, especially economic globalization. That was kind of the behind one of my arguments for why I think we need to have increased trade relations with Iran, is because there's a theory now that says that the perception of future trade relations affects current policy. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you think as a country that the potential for trade with another country will increase in the future, it actually affects the way you behave toward them, even if your current policy is negative toward the country. And that's a theory. It's a researched theory that's been kind of statistically, I don't know if it's been proven, but it's an argument that's being put forward. Not just current trade relations, because that doesn't guarantee that there won't be conflict. If one country thinks they can get it over on another country, they will do it. I do think nations' national interest trumps almost anything else. But if there's the sense that they can there's the potential for investment in the other, then it sometimes lowers the chance of conflict. And so, you know, that's why I was saying I think that having the trade relations is a key component of actually putting forward you know, or having some kind of change in Iran. And as far as the youth, yes, there's a huge divide. We saw that in the 2009 Green Movement, where millions of Iranians were out on the street protesting against Ahmadinejad's re-election because they felt like it was rigged, and it probably was. I mean, all the polls before the election said he wasn't going to win more than 30–40%, and he came out winning 60% of the vote in the first round. So, you know, there was good reason for the Iranians to be skeptical. And the youth, because of another aspect of globalization, social media,
especially the Arab Spring.
Right. Well, this is all before the Arab Spring.
Oh.
This is why I'm saying that the Iranian population is highly literate and highly educated. The literacy rate in Iran now is somewhere close to 99%. There's 60% of Iranian university students are women. Women in Iran can drive. They are fully integrated into the Iranian economy. There's issues with women and gender in Iran, obviously. We know all that. But, well, it contrasts with Saudi Arabia significantly. But, the point is that there is a sea change under the surface there. But does that guarantee that there's going to be a change in the government? Not necessarily. Not without other things happening. That's why I was arguing for some kind of economic opening. Right? Because the sanctions are actually strengthening the regime and weakening the people. So that's my kind of response.
Let me just try briefly to respond to you. First of all, when I say that conquest has been universal, I don't mean that countries are forever going around conquering each other. There was a period in the 19th century when Europe was producing more people than it could possibly use. So Europe was an exporter of people. And if you look at the places in which the imperialism was at work, there were places that, for one reason or another, had to do with Europe's exporting of people. The United States, by the way, was a safety valve for Europe at that time. Simply bald, naked conquest doesn't go on all the time. The Germans tried it in World War II. Clearly it didn't work for them, and they have no taste for it now. So that when I speak of conquest, I don't mean that everybody's conquering all the time, but I'm saying major changes take place as a result of conquest. To conclude, take a look at the map of Germany before World War II and the map today. Well, that wasn't because nice people sat down and said, well, this is a better arrangement for Europe. It's because the Germans were badly defeated, and they had East Prussia taken away from them and other parts taken away from them. And the Germans decided that it wasn't worth the fight, and that they could do just as well, as a matter of fact they've done superbly, without a fight and without conquest. But when major changes take place, the best example I can give is the spread of Islam. In that first 100 years, from 632 to 732, they spread over half the world. And that was the way it was done. Okay, thank you.
Are there any biology students here tonight?
Dr. Robert wants to
I see. A biology student, well, of course, nature also runs according to this program of conflict and conquest, and not just history. It's a fairly deeply embedded thing. Dr. Ward.
Just a thought concerning your observation, Dr. Riggs, and just a question that comes in my mind. If we look at Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State, when he called for the rationale and why he thought it would be appealing both in Argentina and in the Ottoman Empire, the argument was an economic argument. If the Jews were to settle in Argentina, then Latin America would become very prosperous. And likewise, if the Jews were actually able to return to Palestine, then based around that, the debts that because the Ottoman Empire was very heavily in debt, they would be able to begin to be resolved because the Jews would be able to assist them in doing that. So that's a little bit of a dilemma, I think, concerning the question about, the economic dimension of how things could be addressed.
Well, I'm not sure I see where
the question is...
What's the dilemma exactly? Like, I don't understand.
Well, the dilemma is you seem to be saying that because of the economic dimension, people will not enter into conflict if they see that there's some kind of an economic advantage. but in this case, the economic advantage. But basically, what the aspiration of Herzl, and I think even the aspiration of the founding of the state of Israel, was that the Middle East was going to become very prosperous and modernized as a consequence of that, if somehow Israel could have been embraced.
Okay, but he was proposing an imaginary state at the time. He went to the Ottoman Empire and met with him, the Sultan, and he was like, "Hey, you know, give me this area and we'll pay off your debts and all these other things." But he was proposing something that was just a theory. It wasn't actually. I'm talking about a relationship between two different nations, or between nation states that already exist. So I guess that's where I don't see the. I'm not sure about that the analogy holds up for this situation, because I'm talking about the U.S. trading with Iran as two nation states that are already there within a global economic network, right? I mean, to take Iran out of the SWIFT banking system was unprecedented. To be able to make it difficult for Iranians to be able to wire money from the U.S. to Iran was like basically cutting Iran out of the international banking system, which is unheard of in the contemporary world. You know, I'm arguing to restore those ties, and you know, and not just between the U.S. and Iran, but as a fully integrated member of the global economy. So I guess because we're talking about 100 years ago with Herzl, over 100 years ago, I guess I see the world as so much changed. I can't really make a good. I can't make the historical analogy very closely enough.
Could I comment
That's
on
fine.
Herzl? Herzl was what Max Weber called religiously unmusical. And what he didn't count on was the fact that the world of Islam had a certain kind of place for Jews as dhimmis. But the world of Islam, you could talk yourself blue in the face about the economic advantages that the Jews would bring, and they'd say, we're not interested in that. That's not our world. Herzl was on to one thing, on the other hand. Key dates, 1848, 1863, I think, the emancipation first of the Polish peasants and then of the Russian peasants. They were emancipated because they had more peasants than were needed to work on the land. So the peasants go into the cities, and some of them go to North America, and all of a sudden the Jews that had been an urban commercial class and had been a complementary economic class become a competitive economic class with the indigenous population, and that spells their end in Poland and actually in most of Europe. And that's what happened. But he saw that, but he did not see that the world of Islam had no place for them except a few as dhimmis.
I'll step in as moderator one final time here. Do we have one final question for our speakers, and then I'll invite Dean Ward for a closing comment. Yes?
No, I'll say I think we're good.
You think we're good? It's well said and broadly endorsed. You all know Dean Ward, and he needs no introduction.
Dr. Sid, you want to make your announcement very quickly?
Yeah, okay. My capstone class, can you please give me all my maps by Monday latest in my mailbox? And I'll meet you on campus. I'll put the assignment on campus by Monday.
What?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Professor Crumry for organizing tonight's program. And many thanks to Dean Haley for and also my deepest appreciation for our two presenters, Dr. Rubenstein and Dr. Riggs. It was really, I learned a lot tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you all. I think one of the, I guess if you ask me one thing that I thought was most important that I will walk away from tonight with is the fact that we were invited to explore maybe the deepest concerns of the two key players in this conflict. And on both sides, we see that there's a very strong sense of insecurity. Dr. Rubenstein spoke about the challenge and the historical memory of the Israelis, of the Jews. And likewise, Professor Riggs spoke to us and showed us that remarkable map of, on every side, Iran very possibly feeling threatened. And however we want to interpret things, I think it's always important to understand that part that haunts any player, and I won't walk away without forgetting that. This was a great program tonight. I want to thank all of you for coming and for staying here and for learning. I don't think that you can find a program such as the one that you heard tonight anywhere in the state of Connecticut, anywhere. I think that this is a unique venue, and we had a very unique opportunity to learn things that will help us when we watch television, when we read the newspapers, and when we reflect on these questions, which are going to accompany us for the next decade of our lives. Thank you very, very much, and thank all of you for coming.
Well said.